The Secrets of Blackwater Ridge. By the time the letter arrived, Jack Mercer had already spent years pretending his life was enough. The little house outside Flagstaff, Arizona, sat alone at the end of a cracked dirt road where the desert wind never seemed to stop blowing. The paint on the porch rails had peeled years ago. Rust gathered around the mailbox like dried blood. Inside, the rooms felt hollow, as if the house itself had given up trying to sound alive. Every morning followed the same tired rhythm. Coffee, silence, old records spinning in the corner, then hours in the garage rebuilding cars nobody would ever buy. Jack liked old machines because they made sense. Broken parts could be replaced. Rust could be sanded away. Engines told the truth if you listened carefully enough. People never did. Rain tapped softly against the kitchen window that evening, rare for Arizona. The weather report had called it a desert storm moving in from Nevada, but to Jack it sounded like something else. Memory. He sat at the small wooden table with a chipped black mug between his hands while an old Eagles record crackled through the living room. The house smelled faintly of motor oil and stale coffee. Across the room, his late wife's photograph still rested on the shelf untouched after 3 years. Some nights he spoke to it. Tonight he couldn't bring himself to look at it. Outside, headlights briefly swept across the walls as a delivery truck passed the road. Then silence returned. Jack rubbed his tired eyes, 62 years old, and somehow more exhausted than he had ever been working cargo engines in the middle of winter storms off the Pacific coast. That was when he heard the mailbox clang shut. He frowned. Nobody came out this far after dark. For a moment, he ignored it. But something about the sound unsettled him. Slowly, Jack stood, pulling his denim jacket tighter around his shoulders before stepping outside into the cold desert rain. The wind carried dust and wet earth across the yard. At the mailbox sat a single envelope. No stamp, no return address. Just his name written in shaky black ink. Jack Mercer. The handwriting stopped him cold, because he recognized it, or at least part of him did. His pulse slowed, then quickened again. For several seconds he simply stood there beneath the rain, staring at the envelope while old instincts clawed awake deep inside him. Instincts he thought had died 40 years ago. Back inside, he placed the envelope carefully on the kitchen table. The room suddenly felt smaller, quieter. The Eagles record hissed softly in the background. Jack opened the letter with rough mechanic's hands. Inside was a single sentence. "Come back before it's too late." That was all. No name, no explanation. But Jack already knew. Blackwater Ridge. The girl. For the first time in decades, he felt the old fear return. Sharp, immediate, alive. His breathing grew shallow. "No," he muttered quietly to himself. He folded the paper once, then again, as if smaller pieces might somehow weaken the memory attached to it. But memories didn't work that way, especially not the ones buried alive. The storm outside intensified. Rain rattled harder against the windows now, and thunder rolled far across the desert hills. Jack moved toward the hallway closet almost without thinking. He hadn't opened the top shelf in years. Dust coated the cardboard box hidden behind old jackets and tools. His hands hesitated before lifting it down. Inside, old photographs, yellowed newspaper clippings, a silver lighter, and one faded Polaroid he had sworn never to look at again. 3 teenagers standing beside Blackwater Lake. A summer night. Young faces smiling at the camera. And beside Jack stood a girl with dark hair and tired eyes. Emily Grayson, 17 years old. Missing since October 14th, 1983. Officially never found. Jack stared at the photo while distant thunder shook the windows. Then something caught his eye. His stomach tightened instantly. There was fresh ink on the back of the photograph. Fresh, as if someone had written it recently. With trembling fingers, Jack turned it over. 5 words stared back at him. I know what really happened. The coffee mug slipped from his hand and shattered across the kitchen floor. And somewhere far beyond the Arizona storm, the past had finally come back for him. Jack left Arizona before sunrise. He didn't tell anyone. Not that there was anyone left to tell. The desert road stretched endlessly beneath pale gray skies while old rock songs hummed quietly through the truck speakers. The farther north he drove, the colder the air became. By noon, rain clouds swallowed the mountains ahead. For hours, the highway felt empty enough to disappear inside. Gas stations, truck stops, rusting billboards. Lonely diners glowing beneath flickering neon signs. America looked different when you were old enough to remember what it used to be. Jack drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting near the envelope sitting on the passenger seat. He hadn't stopped thinking about the handwriting, or the photograph, or who could possibly know the truth after all these years. The windshield wipers scraped rhythmically through freezing rain. Somewhere outside Gallup, New Mexico, he pulled into an old roadside diner. The place smelled like bacon grease and burnt coffee. A tired waitress in her 60s refilled his mug without asking questions. Jack appreciated people like that, people who understood silence. At the counter, an old country song played softly from a radio mounted near the kitchen. For a few minutes, everything almost felt normal again. Then he saw the lake, not outside, in his mind. Blackwater Lake. October 1983. Cold wind. Moonlight on dark water. Someone screaming. Jack closed his eyes hard. The memory vanished as quickly as it came, but his hand had begun shaking again. "You all right, hun?" the waitress asked gently. Jack nodded once. "Just tired." She smiled politely, though her eyes lingered on him a moment longer than expected. People his age recognized certain kinds of exhaustion, the kind sleep no longer fixed. Back on the highway, the rain intensified. By evening, Montana signs began appearing along the roadside. Pine forests replaced desert rock. The sky turned darker. He rolled down the window briefly and smelled wet earth, cold trees, and distant wood smoke. And suddenly he was 20 again, driving too fast down narrow roads, laughing with friends who had all either disappeared, died, or stopped speaking to him decades ago. A lifetime gone in a blink. The closer he got to Blackwater Ridge, the quieter he became. The town appeared just after sunset. A faded welcome sign leaned crooked beside the road. Welcome to Blackwater Ridge Population, 2104. Someone had scratched away several letters with a knife years ago. Jack slowed the truck. Main Street looked smaller than he remembered. The old hardware store was boarded shut. Neon signs buzzed weakly through the mist. Rainwater shimmered beneath streetlights. An old man standing outside the barber shop froze when he recognized Jack's face, then quickly looked away. Others noticed too. A woman exiting the grocery store stopped walking. Two teenagers near the gas station stared curiously. The town remembered him. That much was suddenly clear. Jack's chest tightened. Blackwater Ridge hadn't forgotten anything. Not really. The motel near the highway still stood exactly where it always had. The vacancy sign flickered unevenly in red neon. Inside, the clerk barely glanced up from the television. "One night?" she asked. "Maybe longer." She handed him the key without interest. Room 12. Same room he stayed in the summer before everything happened. That realization hit harder than expected. The room smelled like old carpet and cigarette smoke trapped from another decade. Jack placed his duffel bag beside the bed and stared through the rain-covered window toward town. Somewhere out there, someone had sent that letter. Someone had written on the photograph. Someone knew the truth. Then headlights appeared outside, slowly moving past the motel. An old black pickup truck. The driver never looked toward the building, but the truck slowed anyway, almost watching. Jack stepped closer to the window. The truck stopped briefly beneath a flickering street lamp, and for just 1 second, he could have sworn the driver was staring directly at him. Then the truck disappeared into the rain, leaving Jack alone with the terrible feeling that his return had already awakened something dangerous. The rain had not stopped since Jack arrived in Blackwater Ridge, and by the following morning the entire town seemed wrapped inside a cold gray haze that blurred the streets, softened the distant pine forests, and made the old buildings along Main Street look like fading memories struggling to survive another winter. Jack stood outside Hale's diner for several seconds before going in. The neon sign above the entrance flickered weakly through the fog, humming with the tired persistence of something old that refused to die, while the smell of wet pavement and chimney smoke drifted quietly through the air around him. 40 years. 40 years since he had last walked through those doors. And yet his hand still hesitated on the handle exactly the same way it had back then. Inside, warmth wrapped around him immediately. Coffee, bacon grease, fresh pie crust. The low murmur of conversations interrupted now and then by silverware clinking against ceramic plates. An old jukebox near the far wall played a soft Fleetwood Mac song distorted slightly by age. And for one strange moment Jack felt as though time inside the diner had simply refused to move forward with the rest of the world. A few customers glanced up when he entered, then quickly looked back down, but not before recognition crossed their faces. Blackwater Ridge remembered everything, especially the things nobody talked about anymore. Jack removed his wet jacket slowly and slid onto a stool near the counter, the cracked leather creaking softly beneath his weight. The waitress pouring coffee froze mid-motion. Margaret Hale, older now, of course. Her dark hair had faded into soft strands of silver near her temples. and faint lines framed her eyes in ways that spoke less of age than of years spent carrying disappointments too heavy to share aloud. Yet somehow she still possessed the same quiet beauty Jack remembered from the summer nights of 1983, when she used to laugh beside the lake with her shoes kicked off in the grass. For several seconds neither of them spoke. The jukebox hummed softly in the background while rain streaked down the windows behind them. Then Margaret finally exhaled. "Well," she said quietly, setting the coffee pot down with careful hands, "either I'm getting old, or hell just froze over." Jack almost smiled. Almost. "Morning, Maggie?" Nobody had called her Maggie in decades. The name seemed to hit her harder than expected because she looked away immediately, focusing on wiping the counter even though it was already clean. "You disappeared pretty good," she said after a moment. "So did everyone else." That earned him a glance. A sharp one. The kind shared between people who knew each other too well to hide behind polite conversation. Margaret poured coffee into his mug, and Jack noticed her hands trembling slightly despite the calm expression she tried to maintain. Outside, wind rattled the diner windows. Inside, the silence between them filled with ghosts. "You shouldn't have come back, Jack," she finally said softly. There it was. Not hello. Not how have you been. Just that. A warning. Jack stared down into the dark coffee swirling inside his mug. "I got a letter." Margaret's face changed instantly. Not dramatically. Just enough. A tightening around the eyes. A brief pause in breathing. Fear. "You need to leave this alone," she whispered. "That easy for you?" "No," she said immediately, her voice lower now. "Nothing about any of this was ever easy." At the far end of the diner, an old man quietly paid his check and left without looking toward them once, though Jack could feel the tension spreading through the room like smoke. People were listening. People always listened in small towns, especially when old wounds started opening again. Jack leaned closer. "Who sent the letter?" Margaret shook her head slowly. "I don't know." "You're lying." A long silence followed, the kind built from years rather than seconds. Then Margaret looked toward the rain-covered window as though searching for courage somewhere beyond the glass. "Not everyone wanted the truth buried," she said quietly. Jack felt his stomach tighten. Before he could respond, the bell above the diner door rang sharply. Everyone looked up. Sheriff Tom Bennett stood just inside the entrance, rain dripping from the brim of his hat onto the wooden floor. Older now, too. Broader, gray-haired, but still carrying the same heavy presence that used to make people step aside without realizing they were doing it. His eyes locked onto Jack instantly, and the warmth inside the diner seemed to disappear all at once. Tom removed his gloves slowly. Neither man smiled. Neither moved. Somewhere in the kitchen, a plate shattered. But nobody looked away, because everyone in Blackwater Ridge understood one thing in that moment. The past had finally walked back into town, and it wasn't finished with any of them yet. By afternoon, the rain had turned colder, falling in thin silver sheets across Blackwater Ridge, while thick fog rolled down from the mountains and settled low between the buildings, swallowing entire sections of town until the streets looked less like roads and more like forgotten paths leading somewhere people no longer wanted to remember. Jack spent the day walking, not because he expected answers, but because sitting still made the memories louder. The old movie theater remained abandoned at the end of Main Street, its faded marquee still displaying letters from some long-forgotten showing decades earlier, while weeds pushed through cracks in the sidewalk nearby, and water dripped steadily from broken gutters onto the empty pavement below. Everything looked smaller now. Or maybe he had simply spent too much time remembering the town through younger eyes. As Jack passed the barber shop, conversations inside stopped. A woman carrying groceries quickly crossed the street to avoid him. An old mechanic standing beneath a gas station awning stared openly until Jack met his gaze, at which point the man immediately pretended to focus on his cigarette instead. The whole town behaved like a person trying not to look at a scar. That afternoon, Jack entered Murphy's Tavern just before sunset. The place smelled of damp wood, old beer, and cigarette smoke soaked permanently into the walls from decades before indoor smoking laws existed, while muted football commentary played quietly from a television hanging crooked above the bar. A few older men sat scattered inside nursing drinks in silence, the kind of silence shared only by people who had known each other too long. Jack took a stool near the end of the counter. The bartender looked up. Recognition flickered immediately. Then, discomfort. "What can I get you?" "Whiskey." The bartender poured without another word. Jack noticed how two men farther down the counter had already stopped talking entirely. One of them finally muttered something under his breath. The other shook his head quickly. Jack took a slow sip before speaking. "Anyone still remember Emily Grayson?" The reaction was immediate. Not loud. Worse. Quiet. One man lowered his eyes into his drink. Another stood up abruptly and headed for the bathroom. The bartender wiped the same glass 3 times without realizing it. Fear moved through the room almost invisibly, like cold air slipping beneath a door. Jack leaned back slightly. "She vanished," he continued calmly. "Someone here must know something." Finally, an older man sitting alone near the window laughed softly to himself without humor. His face looked weathered enough to crumble. "You still chasing ghosts, Mercer?" Jack recognized him after a moment. Walter Briggs, former railroad worker. Used to fish with Jack's father years ago. Walter lifted his drink slowly. "Some things," he said quietly, staring into the amber liquid, "are better left in the ground." The entire bar went still after that. No music, no movement. Only rain tapping against the windows. Jack studied the old man carefully. "What happened that night, Walter?" But Walter simply stood, grabbed his coat, and headed toward the door. Before leaving, he paused beside Jack long enough to whisper something barely audible. "You were never told the whole story." Then he disappeared into the fog outside. Jack sat frozen. The whole story. Not the whole story. For 40 years he had lived with guilt sharp enough to hollow a man from the inside, and now everywhere he turned, people spoke like there had always been something else hidden beneath the surface. Something worse. Something bigger. By the time Jack returned to the motel, night had swallowed the town completely. Rainwater shimmered beneath the parking lot lights. The neon vacancy sign buzzed weakly overhead, and the black pickup truck was parked across the street again. Empty this time. At least it appeared empty. Jack unlocked room 12 slowly, every instinct in his body suddenly alert. The motel room smelled stale and cold. He stepped inside. Silence. Then, crash. The window exploded inward beside him. Glass shattered across the carpet while cold rain burst violently into the room. Jack stumbled backward instinctively as something heavy struck the opposite wall. For one terrifying second, his old instincts returned full force. Heart racing, breathing sharp, eyes scanning darkness. Outside, tires screeched against wet pavement. The black pickup sped away into the storm. Jack turned slowly toward the object lying among broken glass beneath the flickering motel lamp. A brick, wrapped in paper. Rainwater dripped from it onto the carpet while thunder rolled somewhere deep beyond the mountains. Jack unfolded the soaked note carefully. 3 words. Leave it buried. And for the first time since returning home, Jack realized someone in Blackwater Ridge was no longer merely afraid of the truth. They were terrified of it. The storm lingered over Blackwater Ridge all through the night, and by morning the town looked washed in shades of gray and silver, as though the rain had stripped away every remaining trace of warmth from the streets, the storefronts, and the tired faces moving quietly beneath umbrellas along Main Street. Jack barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the motel window shatter again, saw the bricks sliding across the carpet, felt the old fear waking up inside him like something that had never truly gone dormant at all. At dawn, he sat near the cracked motel window with a cup of burnt coffee cooling untouched beside him, while cigarette smoke drifted slowly toward the ceiling, twisting through the pale morning light that leaked weakly through the blinds. The note still rested on the table. Leave it buried. Simple words. But whoever wrote them understood something important about fear. Real fear didn't need threats, only memory. A sharp knock at the door broke the silence. Jack didn't move immediately. The knock came again, slower this time, more deliberate. He crossed the room carefully and opened the door halfway. Sheriff Tom Bennett stood outside beneath the dripping motel awning, one hand resting near his coat pocket while cold rainwater slid from the brim of his hat onto the wooden walkway below. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The years between them felt visible somehow. Heavy, unfinished. "You gonna invite me in?" Tom finally asked. Jack stepped aside without answering. The sheriff entered slowly, his boots creaking against the floorboards while his eyes moved across the broken window, the shattered glass still scattered near the bed, and finally settled on the note lying beside the ashtray. Tom sighed quietly. "You always did know how to stir up trouble." Jack leaned against the wall, arms folded. "Funny," he said calmly. "Feels more like trouble found me." Outside, thunder rolled low beyond the pine-covered hills surrounding town, and for several seconds the only sound inside the motel room came from rain tapping steadily against the remaining glass. Tom picked up the note. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You tell anyone about this?" "No." "Good." Jack studied him carefully. That single word carried too much weight, too much urgency. "You seem nervous, Tom." The sheriff gave a dry smile. At our age, Jack, everything makes me nervous. But the joke landed hollow. Jack knew this man, had known him since childhood, knew the tiny movements Tom made when he lied, the way his eyes briefly avoided direct contact, the way his thumb rubbed against his wedding ring whenever stress crept in. And right now, Tom Bennett looked like a man carrying something far heavier than concern over vandalism. "You should leave town," Tom said quietly. "There it is. I'm serious. So am I." Tom stepped closer now, lowering his voice. "Whatever you think you're looking for, let it go." Jack's expression hardened. "Emily Grayson vanished, Tom." The sheriff looked away immediately. Just for a second, but it was enough. "She's been gone 40 years, and nobody ever found her." "That doesn't mean—" "You know what I think?" Jack interrupted softly. "I think everyone in this town got real comfortable pretending none of it happened." Tom's face darkened. "You don't understand what those years were like." "Then explain them." Silence. Rain. The faint buzz of the motel neon sign outside. Finally, Tom exhaled slowly and moved toward the broken window, staring out into the wet parking lot where puddles reflected distorted patches of gray sky. "People protect their own," he murmured. Jack frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" The sheriff turned back toward him, older now than Jack had ever truly allowed himself to notice. Not intimidating anymore, just tired. "Sometimes," Tom said quietly, "a town survives because certain things stay buried." The words settled heavily between them. Jack felt anger rising slowly beneath his ribs. Not explosive anger. Worse, the cold kind. The kind built over decades. "You knew," he said. Tom's silence answered him. And suddenly Jack remembered another night long ago beside Blackwater Lake, when flashing police lights reflected across dark water while Tom stood nearby, refusing to meet his eyes even back then. The realization hit him hard enough to steal his breath for a moment. "You knew more than you told me." Tom looked genuinely pained now, but not surprised. "Jack." "No." Jack grabbed his jacket. "We're done talking." Before the sheriff could stop him, Jack pushed past him into the cold morning rain and headed straight toward the county records building near the courthouse square, driven now by something stronger than curiosity. Because for the first time since coming back, he understood something clearly. Tom Bennett wasn't trying to protect him. He was trying to protect the town. Inside the nearly empty records office, old fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, while dust floated through narrow beams of pale light between endless rows of filing cabinets and yellowed newspapers stacked like forgotten history. An elderly clerk watched Jack suspiciously from behind thick glasses, but said nothing when he asked for archives from October 1983. Hours passed. Rain battered the windows harder. Jack flipped through brittle newspaper pages filled with football scores, church announcements, and advertisements from businesses long gone. Then suddenly, he froze. A photograph. Small, black and white, blurry from age, but unmistakable. It showed Sheriff Bennett standing near Blackwater Lake the morning after Emily disappeared. Except he wasn't alone. Another figure stood partially hidden beside him. Someone the official reports claimed had never been there. Jack's pulse quickened, because he recognized the coat, and before he could fully process what he was seeing, the lights inside the archive room abruptly went out. Darkness swallowed everything. Then, somewhere deep among the shelves behind him, he heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, getting closer. The footsteps stopped the moment Jack turned around. Darkness filled the archive room completely except for faint storm light leaking through distant windows, casting pale shapes across the filing cabinets, while thunder trembled softly through the walls of the old courthouse building. Jack stood motionless, listening. His heart beat slowly now, controlled. Years spent working dangerous machinery at sea had taught him something valuable long ago. Panic got men killed faster than storms ever did. Another sound came from somewhere deeper inside the room. A scrape. Metal against concrete. Then silence again. "Who's there?" Jack asked quietly. No answer. Only rain hammering against the roof overhead. Jack moved carefully between the shelves, one hand brushing the cold metal cabinets while shadows shifted around him with every flash of distant lightning. But by the time the emergency lights flickered weakly back to life several moments later, the archive room stood empty. Whoever had been there was gone, but the photograph was missing. Jack stared at the empty space on the desk where it had been only seconds earlier, and a heavy unease settled deep in his chest because now there could no longer be any doubt. Someone was watching him closely, someone frightened enough to steal evidence in the dark. Outside, evening had already begun, swallowing Blackwater Ridge beneath thick clouds and freezing rain. When Jack finally stepped back onto Main Street, his coat collar pulled high against the wind, while his mind replayed the image from the missing photograph over and over again. That coat, dark green canvas, worn collar. He had seen it before, not recently, 40 years ago, near the lake. The memory arrived only in fragments, slippery and incomplete like pieces of shattered glass buried underwater, but it was enough to guide him somewhere he had not planned on returning. The old sawmill. The road leading there twisted through dense pine forest several miles outside town, where fog drifted low between the trees and muddy tire tracks disappeared into darkness beneath towering branches swaying violently in the wind. Jack drove slowly. The farther he traveled from town, the quieter the world became. No houses, no lights, only forest and memory. The sawmill finally emerged through the rain like the skeleton of something enormous and dead. Rust covered the machinery. Broken windows stared out into the night like hollow eyes. Sections of the roof had collapsed years earlier, leaving twisted beams exposed against the stormy sky. Jack parked near the entrance and killed the engine. For several seconds he remained still inside the truck while rain struck the windshield in relentless waves. He had not returned here since 1983. Back then the mill had still been operating. Back then the town still smelled of fresh-cut pine and machine oil. Back then nobody imagined how quickly lives could disappear. Jack grabbed his flashlight and stepped into the freezing rain. The mud sucked at his boots as he crossed the empty yard, littered with rusted chains, broken pallets, and weeds growing through cracked concrete. Every sound felt amplified. the groan of old metal, wind moving through shattered windows, rainwater dripping somewhere deep inside the building, and beneath it all, that terrible feeling that someone else was there, waiting. Inside, the flashlight beam cut through darkness thick with dust and decay. Massive saw blades hung frozen in place overhead, while rotten wood creaked beneath Jack's footsteps, each step echoing through the enormous empty structure like distant gunshots. Then he saw it. Near the back wall, a small silver object half hidden beneath collapsed boards. Jack crouched slowly and picked it up. A necklace. Old. Tarnished, but instantly recognizable. Emily Grayson wore it the summer she disappeared. Jack remembered because he himself had once repaired the broken clasp for her beside the lake, while she laughed at his terrible attempt to act like he knew what he was doing. His chest tightened painfully. Why was it here? Before he could think further, the flashlight beam caught something else nearby. Fresh footprints. Recent. Someone had been inside the mill not long ago. Jack followed them carefully deeper into the darkness until they stopped beside a narrow office hidden behind old machinery near the far end of the building. The office door hung slightly open. Inside sat a metal lockbox covered in dust, but not untouched dust, recently disturbed dust. Jack knelt beside it slowly, rainwater still dripping from his coat onto the wooden floor while thunder shook the building overhead. The lock had already been broken. Someone had opened it before him. With cautious hands, Jack lifted the lid. Inside were old documents, photographs, newspaper clippings, and one cassette tape labeled simply October 14th, 1983. Jack's breathing stopped. Then, creak. A floorboard groaned somewhere behind him. Not from the storm, from weight. Someone was standing in the darkness outside the office, watching him. The figure standing beyond the office doorway disappeared before Jack could react. 1 second, there had been the unmistakable sound of weight shifting across old wood, and the next, there was only darkness again, along with the distant groaning of the abandoned sawmill as freezing wind pushed through broken walls and rusted machinery that had not moved in decades. "Hey!" Jack shouted instinctively, his voice echoing violently through the empty building. No response came, only rain, only thunder, only the terrible feeling that someone had wanted him to know they were there. Jack stepped into the corridor with the flashlight raised, sweeping the beam through hanging chains, collapsed shelves, and drifting dust. But whoever had been watching him had vanished into the storm outside as quietly as a memory retreating into the dark corners of the mind. For several seconds he considered chasing them. Then his eyes drifted back toward the cassette tape still resting inside the lockbox. October 14th, 1983. The date alone felt heavy enough to stop his breathing. Slowly, Jack returned to the office and picked up the tape with trembling fingers, staring at the faded handwriting across the label while distant lightning illuminated the room in brief flashes of pale blue light. That night. The night everything broke apart. The night Emily Grayson disappeared. And suddenly the past no longer felt distant at all. It felt alive, waiting, watching him. The drive back to town passed in silence except for windshield wipers scraping against freezing rain while old memories surfaced one by one beneath the rhythm of the storm. each memory incomplete on its own, yet somehow sharp enough to reopen wounds Jack had spent 40 years trying to bury, beneath work, distance, and exhaustion. By the time he reached the motel, midnight had already swallowed Blackwater Ridge beneath thick fog drifting low across empty streets. Jack carried the cassette tape inside like something dangerous. The motel room still smelled faintly of rainwater and shattered glass from the broken window, though the owner had at least covered the opening with plastic sheeting that snapped softly whenever wind pushed against it from outside. Jack sat heavily at the small table beside the lamp. The tape rested in front of him. For a long moment, he simply stared at it. Then finally, he reached into his duffel bag and pulled out an old portable cassette player he used years ago while working cargo ships overseas. The machine clicked loudly in the quiet room. The tape slid inside. Jack pressed play. Static filled the room first, then muffled voices, young voices, laughing, a car engine somewhere nearby. And suddenly Jack was no longer sitting in a motel room in 2026. He was back there. October 14th, 1983. Blackwater Lake. Cold autumn air drifting across dark water while pine trees swayed beneath moonlight sharp enough to silver the surface of the lake. And somewhere far off a radio played softly from the back of an old pickup truck parked crooked near the shoreline. Jack closed his eyes. The memory came fully alive now. He saw himself younger, 22, restless, still believing life stretched endlessly ahead. Tom Bennett stood nearby drinking beer beside the fire while several others laughed around him, their faces bright with the careless confidence of people too young to understand how quickly one terrible night could define the rest of their lives. And Emily. Jack's chest tightened painfully. Emily Grayson stood slightly apart from the others near the edge of the lake, wrapped in an oversized denim jacket while wind moved through her dark hair. Her expression thoughtful in a way Jack had not understood back then because at 22 most men confuse silence with mystery, when often it is simply sadness. She had looked frightened that night. Not visibly, not enough for anyone else to notice. But Jack noticed now in memory what he failed to see then. Someone on the tape laughed loudly. Then another voice interrupted. Male. Angry. The recording crackled badly for several seconds before becoming clearer again. You told me this was over. Jack froze. That voice. He recognized it instantly, even after 40 years. Sheriff Tom Bennett, only younger, more reckless. Emily's voice answered softly, difficult to hear beneath the wind. Then shouting erupted suddenly. Movement, panic. The tape distorted heavily as someone grabbed the recorder. And then came the sound Jack remembered hearing in his nightmares for decades. A scream near the lake, followed by silence. Long, terrible silence. Jack opened his eyes sharply. The motel room returned around him. Rain, darkness, the flickering lamp. His breathing had grown uneven, because there was one thing he remembered now with horrifying clarity, something he had forced himself to forget. That night near the lake. Emily had not been alone when she disappeared. Someone else had arrived after the argument started. Someone unexpected. Someone the official reports never mentioned. And before Jack could process the realization completely, There was a knock at his motel door. 3 slow knocks, then a voice. Quiet, nervous. "Mr. Mercer?" Jack immediately reached beneath the table for the wrench he kept nearby. "Who is it?" A pause, then, "My name's Ethan Cole." Another pause. "I think you and I are looking for the same truth." Ethan Cole looked younger than Jack expected. Not young in the careless sense, but young in the way ambitious men often appear before life teaches them how dangerous curiosity can become. With tired eyes hidden behind wireframe glasses and a rain-soaked coat carrying the smell of wet paper, cigarette smoke, and long nights spent chasing stories most people preferred left untouched. Jack opened the motel door only halfway. "What do you want?" Ethan glanced nervously toward the parking lot before answering. "To talk somewhere safer." Jack almost laughed at that. Nothing in Blackwater Ridge felt safe anymore. Still, something about the young journalist's expression stopped him from shutting the door entirely because beneath the nervousness, Jack recognized another emotion immediately. Fear. Real fear. The kind people carried when they knew too much. 20 minutes later, they sat inside a small office above the town's old hardware store, while rain hammered steadily against the windows and stacks of newspapers, photographs, cassette tapes, and cardboard archive boxes covered nearly every visible surface in the room. The office smelled of dust, coffee, and old ink. A single desk lamp cast warm yellow light across the clutter while the rest of the room remained swallowed in shadow. "You've been busy," Jack muttered quietly. Ethan gave a tired smile. 5 years. Jack looked at him sharply. "You've been investigating Emily Grayson for 5 years?" "Officially?" Ethan replied. "No." He pulled a folder from the desk carefully. "Officially, I write local history pieces for the Gazette." Jack studied him silently. "And unofficially?" Ethan hesitated before answering. "Unofficially. My father was one of the deputies working the lake that night." The room suddenly felt colder. Ethan opened the folder slowly, revealing dozens of old photographs clipped together with handwritten notes and newspaper articles yellowed badly with age. "My father drank himself to death when I was 19, Ethan said quietly while flipping through the papers. "But before he died, he kept saying the same thing over and over." Jack leaned forward slightly. "What thing?" Ethan met his eyes. "That the town buried more than a body." Silence settled heavily between them. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains. Jack stared down at the photographs spread across the desk. Blackwater Lake, police cars, crowds gathered behind barricades, teenagers being questioned. Then one image caught his attention instantly. His younger self standing beside Sheriff Bennett near the shoreline. Tom looked terrified, not grieving. Terrified. Jack's stomach tightened. "That photo shouldn't exist," he murmured. Ethan nodded slowly. "There are a lot of things that shouldn't exist." The journalist crossed the room and inserted another cassette tape into an old recorder sitting near the filing cabinet. Static crackled softly. Then a woman's voice filled the office. Panicked, crying. She said she was going to tell everyone. The recording abruptly ended. Jack looked up sharply. "Who is that?" "I don't know," Ethan admitted. The tape was hidden inside courthouse archives until someone removed several files last year. Jack's expression darkened immediately. Someone's been cleaning up evidence. Exactly. Rain slammed harder against the windows now, while wind rattled the glass violently enough to make the old building creak. Ethan moved toward a corkboard pinned with maps and photographs connected by faded red string. At the center sat a photograph of Emily Grayson smiling beside Blackwater Lake. Around her were dozens of names, some crossed out, some circled. Jack stared at one circled name longer than the others. Walter Briggs, the old railroad worker from the bar. You talked to Walter? Ethan nodded. Before he disappeared. Jack turned sharply. What do you mean disappeared? He left town 3 days ago. Why? Ethan's face tightened uneasily. He told me someone was watching his house at night. A long silence followed. Then Ethan carefully removed one final photograph from the board. This, he said quietly, is why I contacted you. Jack took the photograph slowly. It showed Emily near the lake only hours before she vanished. Several teenagers stood nearby laughing around the fire. Tom Bennett was there. Jack himself was there. But farther back near the trees stood another figure partially hidden in shadow. A man wearing a dark green canvas coat. Jack's pulse slowed instantly. Because he knew that coat. He had seen it before, recently, in memory, and perhaps worst of all, he knew exactly who it belonged to. Then Ethan spoke the words that made the room feel suddenly airless. The problem is, he whispered. Official records say that man was out of town the night Emily disappeared. After leaving Ethan's office, Jack drove through Blackwater Ridge without turning on the radio, because silence now felt less dangerous than thought, and every rain-covered street, every darkened storefront, every shadow standing beneath the flickering lamps along Main Street seemed to carry the unsettling weight of recognition, as though the town itself had awakened and begun watching him the moment he started pulling at truths buried too deeply for ordinary people to survive uncovering. The photograph rested on the passenger seat beside him, the man in the dark green canvas coat. Even after all these years, Jack knew who it was, or at least he thought he did. But the problem with memory, especially old memory soaked in guilt and fear, was that it shifted over time like fog over water, changing shape each time you looked at it closely enough. Rain swept across the windshield while the motel sign appeared ahead through the darkness, buzzing weakly in red neon against the storm. Room 12 waited exactly as he had left it. Cold, dim, temporary. Jack entered carefully, every instinct sharpened now by the growing certainty that he was no longer merely investigating the past. The past was investigating him back. Inside, the plastic covering the broken window rattled softly in the wind, while distant thunder rolled through the mountains beyond town. And for a moment, Jack simply stood in silence, listening to the old building breathe around him. Then the phone rang. The sound exploded through the room so suddenly that even Jack flinched. 3 sharp rings. Pause. Then another. He stared at the phone for several seconds before answering. Yeah? Nothing, only static, faint breathing somewhere on the other end. Jack's expression hardened. Who is this? Silence again. Then a click. The line went dead. Jack lowered the receiver slowly. His pulse remained calm, but something deeper had begun tightening inside him now, because anonymous threats were one thing. Silence was worse. Silence meant someone wanted him afraid enough to imagine his own nightmares. The phone rang again less than 10 minutes later. This time, the voice came immediately. Low, distorted. "You should have stayed gone." Jack gripped the receiver tighter. "Who's talking?" A pause, then, "You still don't remember everything about that night." The line disconnected again. Outside, headlights moved slowly past the motel. Jack stepped toward the window instantly. The black pickup truck. Again. Crawling through the rain at walking speed. Watching. Jack grabbed his coat and moved outside before he could think better of it. Cold wind hit him immediately, carrying the smell of wet pine and approaching frost, while rain soaked through his jacket within seconds. But the pickup was already turning onto the highway leading north out of town. Jack climbed into his own truck and followed. The roads beyond Blackwater Ridge twisted through dense forest, where fog drifted low between towering pines, swallowing sections of asphalt beneath shifting white haze, while headlights cut narrow tunnels through darkness thick enough to feel almost physical. The black pickup remained ahead, never speeding, never disappearing completely, as though the driver wanted to be followed. Jack's jaw tightened. Old instincts returned again. The same instincts he once used navigating storms at sea, where one mistake could bury men beneath black water forever. The pickup finally turned onto a narrow logging road leading deeper into the mountains. Jack followed cautiously. Mud sprayed beneath the tires, while branches scraped against the sides of the truck, and thunder rumbled somewhere far above the trees. Then suddenly, the pickup stopped. Its brake lights glowed red through the rain. Jack slowed carefully several yards behind it. For a moment, nothing moved. No doors opened, no engines died. Only rain hammering against metal. Then the driver's door creaked open. A figure stepped out slowly into the darkness. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark coat. Jack opened his own truck door immediately and stepped into the storm. "Hey!" The figure froze briefly near the edge of the trees. Lightning flashed overhead. And for one terrible second, Jack saw the man's face clearly enough to stop breathing. Not because he recognized the man, but because he recognized the walk. That slight, uneven limp. The same limp carried by someone Jack had not seen since 1983. The figure disappeared into the woods before Jack could react. "Wait!" Jack pushed forward through mud and rain, flashlight beams shaking through the trees while wind roared overhead. But the forest swallowed the stranger completely. Gone. Only footprints remained briefly in the wet earth before rain erased them too. Jack stood alone among the pines, breathing hard while cold water dripped from his hair and jacket. Then he noticed something hanging from a broken branch nearby. A silver lighter, old, scratched, engraved with initials. T.B. Tom Bennett. And suddenly Jack understood something that made the cold feel far worse. Someone wanted him to suspect the sheriff. The question was why. The next morning arrived wrapped in dense fog so thick that Blackwater Ridge seemed less like a town and more like a fading memory trapped somewhere between sleep and waking. while cold rain drifted steadily from pale gray skies, and the pine forests surrounding the valley disappeared entirely behind walls of white mist. Jack barely slept. Again. The silver lighter sat on the motel table beside the photograph from Ethan's office, and all night long he had stared at those engraved initials while old memories moved restlessly through his mind like shapes beneath dark water. Tom Bennett, best friend, fishing trips, high school football games, late-night beers beside the lake, and now, lies. Or perhaps worse than lies, half-truths. The kind capable of destroying entire lives. By late morning, Ethan called with another name, Eleanor Whitmore. "You need to talk to her before someone else does," Ethan said quietly over the phone. "Why?" A long pause followed. "Because she was there after Emily disappeared." Jack frowned. "At the lake?" "No," Ethan replied softly. "At the hospital." The line went silent for a moment. Then Ethan added something that stayed with Jack the entire drive across town. "She's been afraid for 40 years, Jack." Eleanor Whitmore lived alone near the northern edge of Blackwater Ridge, where the town slowly dissolved into forest and open fields, and her small white farmhouse stood surrounded by dying gardens, rusted wind chimes, and tall pine trees bending beneath cold autumn wind that carried the scent of rain and distant wood smoke through the valley. The house looked fragile, like its owner. Jack parked beside the gravel driveway and sat for a moment watching thin smoke rise from the chimney while crows circled overhead against the colorless sky. Something about the place unsettled him immediately. Not danger, sadness, the kind that settles permanently into walls after years of silence. When Eleanor opened the door, she looked smaller than Jack expected, tiny almost, wrapped in a faded gray sweater with silver hair pinned loosely behind her head, and tired blue eyes that seemed to hold decades of unspoken grief beneath their softness. For several seconds she simply stared at him, not surprised, not angry, just tired. "I wondered how long it would take before you came," she said quietly. Her voice carried the calm heaviness of someone who had spent years preparing for a conversation she hoped would never happen. Inside, the farmhouse smelled of tea, old books, and cedar wood, while rain tapped gently against the windows, and an antique clock ticked steadily somewhere deeper inside the house. Photographs covered nearly every surface. Family portraits, old holidays, black and white snapshots from another lifetime. Jack noticed one photograph immediately. Emily Grayson, smiling beside Eleanor on a fishing dock near Blackwater Lake. "She used to help me feed the birds," Eleanor said softly, after noticing where Jack was looking. "Every Sunday morning." Jack swallowed carefully. The older woman guided him toward a small kitchen where steam curled gently from a kettle resting on the stove, and as she poured tea into delicate floral cups with trembling hands, Jack noticed how often she glanced toward the windows as though afraid someone might be watching the house from outside. Finally, she sat across from him. For a long moment, neither spoke. Only rain. Only the ticking clock. Only memory pressing against the silence. Then, Eleanor folded her hands carefully together and looked directly into Jack's eyes. "You still believe Emily died that night?" she whispered. Jack frowned slowly. What are you talking about? The old woman's expression trembled, and suddenly Jack realized she had been carrying this truth alone for far too long. She didn't die at the lake. The room seemed to go still. Even the rain felt quieter somehow. Jack stared at her without blinking. What? Eleanor's hands shook harder now. I saw her, she whispered. Hours later. Jack's pulse slowed sharply. That's impossible. No, Eleanor replied, tears beginning to gather in her tired eyes. What's impossible is what they made everyone believe afterward. Jack leaned forward slowly, every instinct inside him screaming now. What happened, Eleanor? The old woman looked toward the rain-covered window again before answering, and when she finally spoke, her voice had become barely more than a frightened whisper. She came to the hospital that night covered in blood and terrified out of her mind. Jack stopped breathing, and she kept saying someone was trying to kill her. Jack left Eleanor Whitmore's farmhouse long after sunset, yet the old woman's trembling words continued echoing inside his mind with a terrible persistence that made the cold rain falling across Blackwater Ridge feel distant and unreal, as though the entire town had slowly begun slipping away from the world he thought he understood, and into something darker, stranger, and infinitely more dangerous than a 40-year-old disappearance. She came to the hospital. The sentence repeated itself endlessly. Emily had survived the lake, at least for a while, which meant someone lied, not just to the town, to him, for 40 years. The windshield wipers moved heavily across the truck glass while fog rolled low along the empty roads, swallowing telephone poles and pine trees whole before releasing them again in ghostly fragments beneath the headlights. And somewhere beyond the mountains thunder rumbled softly like something ancient turning in its sleep. Jack gripped the wheel tighter. His memories no longer fit together properly. Everything he believed about that night had begun cracking apart piece by piece, and beneath those fractures waited a truth ugly enough that entire lives had apparently been built around hiding it. The sheriff's office still glowed faintly when Jack reached town. A single lamp burned behind the front windows while rainwater streamed steadily from the gutters overhead. And for several seconds, Jack simply sat inside the truck staring at the building where Tom Bennett had spent most of his life protecting Blackwater Ridge from outsiders, drunks, storms, and bad decisions. But perhaps not from itself. Jack stepped out into the freezing rain. Inside, the sheriff sat alone behind his desk with reading glasses low on his nose and an untouched cup of coffee cooling beside a stack of paperwork. Though the moment Jack entered, Tom looked up with the exhausted expression of a man who had spent days waiting for something terrible to finally arrive. You shouldn't be here, Tom said quietly. Jack closed the office door behind him. Eleanor talked. The sheriff's face changed instantly. Not surprise. Resignation. Outside, wind rattled the windows hard enough to shake the blinds while somewhere deeper inside the station, an old radio crackled softly with distant dispatch chatter. Tom removed his glasses slowly. What exactly did she tell you? That Emily made it to the hospital alive. Silence, heavy, unavoidable. Jack stared at the man who had once been closer than a brother to him, and for the first time in decades he realized how tired Tom truly looked, not physically but spiritually. like someone who had carried a weight far too long and no longer remembered who he had been before it. "You lied to me," Jack whispered. Tom lowered his eyes. "Yes." The honesty hit harder than denial ever could have. Jack stepped closer. "For 40 years? I didn't have a choice." "There's always a choice." Tom laughed bitterly at that. "No, Jack," he said softly, looking back up now with something close to anger buried beneath the exhaustion. "There really isn't." Rain slammed violently against the windows. Jack's voice hardened. "She was alive. Why the hell wasn't anyone looking for her?" Tom stood abruptly from behind the desk. "Because by then things had already gone too far." The words echoed through the small office. Jack's chest tightened painfully. "What does that mean?" Tom rubbed both hands across his face before answering, and for a brief moment he looked very old. "It means people panicked." "What people?" Again silence. Again avoidance. Jack felt fury rising slowly now, cold and steady. "Who was at that lake besides us?" Tom looked away. "That's not the question you should be asking." "Then what is?" The sheriff met his eyes fully now. "The real question is why Emily was so terrified before any of this even started." Jack froze. Because deep down, buried beneath 40 years of guilt and distorted memory, he remembered something now. Emily had been frightened before the argument, before the screaming, before the lake. And suddenly another memory surfaced. Her voice beside the fire that night. Quiet. Nervous. "I need to tell someone." Jack staggered backward slightly as realization moved through him like ice water. Tom noticed immediately. "You remember now, don't you?" Jack's breathing slowed. "She was afraid of somebody." Tom said nothing, which was answer enough. Jack slammed both hands against the desk suddenly. "Who?" The sheriff's composure finally cracked. "You still don't understand what really happened that night," he shouted. The room fell silent instantly afterward, except for the storm raging outside. Both men stood frozen, breathing hard. Years of buried anger suddenly exposed between them. Then Tom's expression changed again. Fear. Real fear. He moved toward the window slowly. "They're going to find it," he whispered. Jack frowned. "Find what?" Before Tom could answer, police radio chatter exploded loudly behind the desk. Static. Then a nervous deputy's voice. "Sheriff, you need to get out to Blackwater Lake immediately." Tom closed his eyes, as if he already knew. The deputy continued. "Something just surfaced." By the time Jack reached Blackwater Lake, half the town had already gathered along the shoreline beneath flashing police lights and freezing rain, while fog drifted low across the black water and wind bent the surrounding pine trees hard enough to make their branches groan like old wooden ships caught in a storm. The lake looked exactly the same. That was the worst part. 40 years had passed, yet the water remained dark and still beneath the stormy Montana sky, holding its secrets with the same terrible patience it always had, as though time itself behaved differently here. Emergency vehicles lined the muddy access road. Deputies pushed nervous townspeople behind yellow tape. No one spoke loudly. The entire scene carried the suffocating atmosphere of a funeral nobody wanted to attend. Jack stepped from his truck into freezing wind while rain soaked through his jacket instantly, and as he moved toward the shoreline, he noticed faces turning toward him one by one through the mist. Watching, whispering, remembering. Because everybody in Blackwater Ridge understood what this meant. The past was no longer buried beneath rumor and silence. The lake had finally decided to give something back. Tom Bennett stood near the water beside two state divers wearing heavy rain gear while rotating emergency lights painted the shoreline in flashes of red and blue that reflected across the surface of the lake like fractured memories. The sheriff looked pale, older than ever. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Jack followed Tom's gaze toward the water. A rusted section of metal barely protruded above the surface several yards offshore. A car roof. Jack felt his stomach tighten instantly. The divers had already attached cables while a tow truck idled nearby with its engine rumbling softly through the storm, and every person standing near the shore seemed to hold their breath simultaneously as the steel cable slowly tightened against the submerged vehicle hidden beneath decades of black water and lake sediment. Mud churned violently. Water rippled outward. Then slowly, the car emerged. Gasps spread through the crowd. The vehicle looked skeletal beneath layers of rust, algae, and rotting weeds hanging from shattered windows like drowned vines, while muddy water poured endlessly from the interior as though the lake itself resisted letting it go. Jack couldn't move because he recognized the car immediately. A dark blue Chevrolet Nova. Emily Grayson's car. The same car police claimed had never been found. Someone near the crowd whispered a prayer. Another person quietly started crying. Tom removed his hat slowly. Rainwater streamed down his gray hair while deputies illuminated the vehicle with flashlights cutting through fog and darkness. One of the divers approached the driver's side carefully. "The door's jammed," he called out. Jack's pulse pounded now. Not from fear, from memory. He remembered Emily leaving the party upset that night, remembered hearing her car engine near the road, remembered God. Jack's breathing became uneven. He remembered someone following her. The diver finally forced the driver's door open with a metallic groan sharp enough to make several people flinch. Everyone watched. Even the storm itself seemed quieter suddenly. The diver leaned inside with his flashlight. Several seconds passed. Then he froze. Tom stepped forward immediately. "What is it?" The diver looked back slowly. His expression had gone pale beneath the rain. "There's no body." Murmurs exploded through the crowd. Confusion, fear, shock. Jack stared at the empty interior while cold wind tore across the shoreline hard enough to sting his face, and for one impossible moment he felt the entire foundation of the last 40 years collapsing beneath him, because if Emily's car had been hidden here all this time without a body inside, then someone had wanted the town to believe she died. Someone had staged the entire thing. The diver climbed partially back into the vehicle. "Wait!" he shouted suddenly. He reached beneath the passenger seat carefully before pulling something free from thick mud and lake weeds. A leather satchel. Old but preserved enough to remain intact. Tom took it with trembling hands. The sheriff hesitated only briefly before opening it. Inside sat several water-damaged papers, a small revolver, and one sealed envelope. Across the front, written in faded black ink, were 3 words that made Jack's blood run cold. For Jack Mercer. The sheriff looked at him slowly through the rain. Around them, the town stood frozen beneath flashing lights and drifting fog, while the lake rippled softly against the shore like something alive breathing in darkness. Then Tom handed him the envelope and quietly said the words Jack would never forget. She knew she wasn't going to survive the night. The envelope felt impossibly heavy in Jack's hands as he stood beside Blackwater Lake, beneath freezing rain and flashing emergency lights, while all around him the people of Blackwater Ridge remained frozen in stunned silence, staring at the rusted car half-pulled from the dark water like witnesses at the edge of a grave that had finally opened after 40 years of swallowing secrets. Tom Bennett said nothing. Neither did the deputies. Even the wind seemed quieter now, moving carefully through the pine trees surrounding the shoreline, as though nature itself understood that something long buried had begun clawing its way back into the light. Jack looked down at the faded handwriting across the envelope. For Jack Mercer, Emily's handwriting. There was no doubt. His chest tightened painfully. For decades he had carried the belief that she died that night because he failed her somehow, because he had not stayed near the lake, because he had walked away angry and confused, while fear spread through the darkness around them like smoke. But now, everything was different. With trembling fingers, Jack carefully opened the envelope while rainwater dripped from his sleeves and gathered along the paper edges. Inside rested several folded pages and 1 photograph. Jack unfolded the photograph first. The image instantly stole the breath from his lungs. It showed Emily standing beside a man near the sawmill several weeks before her disappearance. The man's face was partially turned away, but Jack recognized him immediately. Mayor Richard Voss, one of the most respected men Blackwater Ridge had ever known. Dead nearly 20 years now. Church volunteer, business owner, town hero. And suddenly, another memory surfaced. Emily arguing beside the fire that night. "You promised me." Jack's stomach turned. He unfolded the letter slowly. The paper shook in his hands while rain hammered softly against the lake around them. "Jack, if you're reading this, then something went wrong. I tried to leave town tonight. I tried to tell people the truth, but they won't let me. Richard said nobody would believe me anyway. He said people like him always survive. Maybe he's right, but if anything happens to me, you need to know this wasn't your fault. None of it was. I was pregnant." Jack's vision blurred instantly. The storm disappeared. The voices nearby vanished. Only those 2 words remained. Pregnant. He stared down at the page, unable to breathe, while 40 years of guilt, confusion, grief, and unanswered questions crashed through him all at once with devastating force. Emily had not been afraid of Jack. She had not been afraid of Tom. She had been afraid of Richard Voss, the mayor, one of the most powerful men in town. Jack continued reading. He said if I talked, he'd destroy my family. He said nobody would ever believe a girl like me over a man like him. Tom tried to help me. So did Eleanor. But by then too many people already knew. Too many people were scared. If you're reading this now, Then maybe somebody finally decided the truth mattered more than protecting this town. I'm sorry I dragged you into this, and Jack, I never blamed you." The letter ended there. Jack lowered the pages slowly while rain mixed with tears he had not allowed himself to shed in decades. Nearby, Tom Bennett stood motionless beneath the storm. Everything suddenly made sense now. The fear, the lies, the cover-up, the missing reports, the staged disappearance. Blackwater Ridge had not hidden Emily's death. They had hidden Richard Voss, because exposing him would have destroyed the town itself, the local economy, the mill, families, careers, lives. And in their fear, they had sacrificed truth instead. Jack looked toward the gathered townspeople near the shoreline. Many already understood. He could see it in their faces. Not shock, recognition. This secret had poisoned the town for generations. Tom finally stepped closer through the rain. "She came to me that night," he said quietly. "Said Richard hurt her. Said she wanted to leave town before he found her again." Jack closed his eyes briefly. "What happened after the hospital?" Tom's expression darkened with old pain. "She disappeared before sunrise." Jack looked up sharply. "You let her leave?" "No," Tom whispered. "I tried to stop her." The sheriff stared out across the lake. "But somebody got to her first." Silence spread again. Cold. Heavy. Then Ethan Cole stepped forward from the crowd holding another file in shaking hands. "We found this in the courthouse storage room an hour ago." He handed it to Jack. Inside sat a birth certificate, yellowed with age. Mother, Emily Grayson. Father, unknown. Date, March 1984. Jack felt his pulse stop, because beneath the paperwork sat a second document. Adoption records, sealed, and the child's name written across the top changed everything. Ethan Cole. The rain finally stopped sometime before dawn, leaving Blackwater Ridge wrapped beneath heavy fog and absolute silence, while pale gray morning light slowly spread across the mountains, the lake, and the exhausted faces of people who had spent the entire night watching the foundations of their town crack apart beneath truths buried too long to survive exposure. Ethan sat alone inside the sheriff's office, staring at the adoption papers as though they belonged to someone else entirely, while Jack remained near the window, unable to fully process the terrible beauty of fate that had carried the young journalist back toward the very mystery that shaped his entire life, before he was even old enough to remember it. Emily's son. The realization still felt unreal. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he turned another page. "My father knew," he whispered. Tom Bennett nodded tiredly from behind his desk. "Yes. Why didn't he tell me?" The sheriff looked toward the old photographs hanging along the office wall. "Because he promised your mother he'd protect you from this town." Ethan laughed bitterly at that. "Protect me?" he said softly. "By lying my whole life?" Nobody answered, because there was no answer capable of repairing damage this old. Outside, fog drifted through the empty streets while church bells rang quietly somewhere beyond town, their sound carrying across Blackwater Ridge with a strange sadness that made the morning feel less like a new beginning and more like the final moments of something dying slowly. Jack stood motionless near the window. For 40 years he had hated himself, blamed himself, punished himself. But now the truth sat exposed before him in fragments too painful to ignore. Emily had trusted him. Tom had tried to help. Eleanor had hidden the truth out of fear. And Richard Voss. Richard had destroyed everything long before Emily disappeared. Jack closed his eyes. He remembered now. The final missing piece. That night near the lake after the argument began, Jack had seen Richard arrive in his truck furious and drunk with panic, while Emily screamed at him beside the water and Tom tried desperately to keep things from spiraling out of control. Then came the struggle. The gun. The accidental shot. Not murder. Chaos. Fear. Emily injured, terrified, still alive afterward. Richard had begged everyone to keep quiet, threatened them, promised the town would collapse if the scandal became public. And little by little, fear won. Jack remembered leaving the lake believing Emily would go to the hospital safely. He never knew she vanished afterward. Never knew Tom spent weeks secretly searching for her outside town. Never knew Eleanor hid evidence to protect Emily's unborn child. Never knew the town itself became trapped beneath the weight of one terrible decision made out of fear instead of courage. Jack slowly turned toward Tom. "You should have told me." The sheriff looked older than ever now. "I wanted to," he admitted quietly. "God knows I wanted to." "Then why didn't you?" Tom's eyes filled with exhaustion. "Because after enough years passed, Jack, people stopped protecting the lie." He swallowed hard. "They start protecting the life they built around it." The words settled heavily inside the room. Nobody moved. Then Ethan stood slowly holding another photograph. This was hidden with the adoption papers. He handed it to Jack. The picture showed Emily sitting outside Eleanor's farmhouse shortly before her disappearance, one hand resting gently against her stomach, while morning sunlight touched her face in a way that made her look peaceful, despite the fear still visible behind her eyes. On the back, she had written only one sentence: "Don't let my son become this town." Jack stared at the words for a very long time. Then finally he looked toward Ethan. "You're not responsible for any of this." Ethan gave a weak smile. "Neither were you." And somehow those words hurt more than blame ever had. Because forgiveness often arrives too late to undo the damage guilt leaves behind. Outside, sunlight slowly began piercing through the fog for the first time in days, illuminating wet streets, old storefronts, and the tired little town that had spent 40 years drowning beneath silence. And in that quiet morning light, Jack finally understood something painful. The real villain had never been one man alone. It had been fear. Fear powerful enough to make decent people betray truth simply to survive. 3 days later, the first clear sunrise of the season spread slowly across Blackwater Ridge, washing the mountains in pale gold, while fog lifted gently from the lake, and cold autumn wind carried the scent of pine, wet earth, and wood smoke through streets that somehow looked lighter now, as though the town itself had finally exhaled after holding its breath for 40 years. The storm was over. Not completely. Perhaps storms like this never truly ended. But something had changed. People spoke more softly now, looked each other in the eye again, Old conversations long avoided began resurfacing quietly inside diners, barber shops, church basements, and front porches throughout town. Truth had finally entered places silence once lived. Jack stood alone beside Blackwater Lake just after sunrise, with both hands buried deep inside the pockets of his denim jacket, while gentle waves rolled against the shoreline, and distant birds moved low across the water beneath the morning sky. The lake no longer frightened him. For years he had imagined this place as a grave. Now it felt more like memory, sad, heavy, but honest. Nearby, a small memorial had appeared overnight beside the dock. Flowers, photographs, handwritten notes. Someone had placed one of Emily's favorite songs beneath a small portable radio, playing softly in the cold morning air. Jack stared at her photograph for a long moment, then quietly sat on the weathered dock where they once spent summer evenings talking about escaping Blackwater Ridge together before life taught them how difficult escape really was. The wood creaked softly beneath him. Sunlight reflected gently across the water, and for the first time in decades, the guilt inside him no longer felt unbearable. Pain remained. It always would. But pain and guilt were not the same thing. Behind him, footsteps approached slowly. Jack turned. Margaret Hale stood there holding 2 cups of coffee while autumn wind moved through her silver hair, and morning light softened the sadness in her tired eyes. "You always did wake up too early," she said quietly. Jack smiled faintly. "So did you." She handed him a cup before sitting beside him on the dock. For several minutes, neither spoke. They simply watched sunlight spread across the lake, while distant church bells echoed through the valley, and smoke rose lazily from chimneys throughout town. Finally, Margaret exhaled softly. "You leaving again?" Jack looked out across the water. For most of his life, running had felt easier than staying. Arizona, cargo ships, empty highways, lonely motel rooms, always moving, always avoiding the same ghosts. But something inside him had shifted now, not healed completely. Maybe people never healed completely. Maybe they simply learned which pain no longer deserved control over the rest of their lives. "I don't know," he admitted honestly. Margaret smiled gently. "That's probably the first honest answer you've given anyone in 40 years. Jack laughed quietly under his breath. A real laugh this time. Small, rusted from disuse, but real. The sound surprised even him. Across town, church bells rang again. Somewhere nearby, Ethan's truck passed slowly along the road heading toward the Gazette office, where he would spend the next several months writing the true story of Emily Grayson and the town that lost itself trying to bury her. Tom Bennett had already announced his retirement. Eleanor Whitmore finally slept through the night for the first time in years. And Blackwater Ridge, despite all its scars, remained standing. Not perfect, not innocent, but perhaps finally honest. Jack reached into his jacket pocket slowly and removed the old photograph of Emily from decades earlier. The edges had faded badly with time, but her smile remained untouched. He looked at it one final time before carefully placing it beneath the flowers at the memorial. Then he stood. The cold morning wind moved gently across the lake while sunlight broke fully through the clouds at last, turning the dark water gold. Jack took a long breath, and somewhere deep inside himself, after 40 years of carrying ghosts across highways, oceans, and sleepless nights, he finally let one go.